During World War II, Japan committed some of the most heinous atrocities in modern history. The list is endless: executions of civilians thrown into mass graves, injection of diseases and plagues into prisoners of war, massive rapes and impalement of infants. Lack of scruples and contempt for human life were part of the imperial ideology. Fortunately, the Axis was defeated, and its leaders had to answer to international law. Due to Japanese savagery, the Allies decided to conduct an unprecedented process in the heart of the archipelago, the Tokyo Trials. For almost 3 years, hundreds of brutal crimes were reviewed, resulting in executions and severe penalties, but also giving rise to controversies that are still being debated today. In this installment of military history, we invite you to one of the most important events of the post-war period, to learn how the atrocities of Imperial Japan were paid for. In the midst of World War II, Allied leaders Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin issued a proclamation that was fundamental to history. In that document, they announced that when the conflict ended, all military leaders of the Axis would be judged for their crimes. The determination was reaffirmed during the Tehran Conference in 1943, the Yalta Conference in 1945, and the Potsdam Conference later that same year. Once the war in Asia ended on August 15, 1945, the United States Army occupied the entirety of Japan and a large part of the country's former Asian colonies. From that moment on, the persecution and detention of high-ranking members of the Japanese government and military, guilty of some of the most harrowing atrocities of the time, began. The Allies knew that the archipelago had acted brutally, which is why, parallel to the Nuremberg trials, an international military tribunal for the Far East was established. The aim was to judge the accused of crimes outlined in a document known as the London Charter. The Tokyo War Academy was chosen as the venue for the trials because it was one of the few buildings still standing at the end of the conflict.
Mr. President, the witnesses in court will now be sworn. You are now called to testify as a witness in this case now before the tribunal. And you have a duty to tell the truth and nothing but the truth.
So began the process, presenting one of the hundreds of witnesses of the massacre. Before delving into this aspect, let's first talk about the composition of that jury. The tribunal was composed of a panel of judges appointed by the victorious countries of the war. It was clear that, along with the conflict, the Allies had also earned the right to write history, and that meant judging the crimes of the enemy. The participating countries were the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, China, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India, and the Philippines. The significant presence of Asian nations is because many of them were the ones who suffered from the activities of the Japanese Imperial Army. The prosecution was led by the American Joseph Keenan, and it included prosecutors from all the countries that appointed judges to the tribunal. On August 8, 1945, work began, but it took almost a year to gather the necessary documents, apprehend the accused, and build a solid case. During the last months of 1945, members of both defense and prosecution worked against the clock to support their positions with evidence. The eerie fact is that the victims' corpses were still fresh. The thousands of graves and detention centers set up by Japan were near urban areas and were easily accessible to investigators. Later, we will detail what kind of atrocities occurred within their walls. Let's listen to the testimonies of a Chinese citizen who remembered the treatment received by their women.
Some interpreters forced over 40 Chinese women into an open square and there compelled them to undress under threats of bayonets and to walk around in full view of the residents, who were required to kneel on the ground and witness the scene. If a spectator diverted his eyes, he would be struck with a rifle butt. The Japanese soldiers laughed and clapped their hands.
On May 3, 1946, the team of prosecutors led by Keenan presented the indictments, holding several Japanese officials, generals, and leaders responsible for misdeeds against peace, which broke with the war crimes treaties signed prior to the conflict. The volume of the documents was so large that it took several weeks to complete the reading and presentation of the facts, each with a morbid wealth of detail. Once this first part was finalized, it was time for the long and tortuous debate on the responsibilities and the appropriate sentences for each accused. In total, the Tokyo trials lasted more than 2.5 years, and the testimonies of 419 witnesses were heard, with a total of 4,236 pieces of evidence, including contributions from almost 800 specialists. It was the longest and most complex judicial process carried out in Asia, the first of its kind, both for the number of people who participated and for the nature of the crimes being evaluated. From mass massacres carried out in China, in the various concentration camps established by the empire in the Manchuria area, to the mistreatment and execution of prisoners of war. The latter was one of the central points, since captured soldiers who did not resist being captured must be treated humanely. However, within Japanese prisons that word did not exist. Starvation and beatings were the most frequent, to the point of beating dozens of Americans and Chinese to death with clubs. Below, we will see material recorded during the liberation of Uncle Sam's soldiers. The soldier's smile is that of a man tasting food and cigarettes for the first time in months. Testimonies account for meager rations of just one bowl of rice per day. Much of the brutality exercised by Japan was uncovered during this long and torturous trial. For example, the sinister work of the Buntai-jo, a kind of captains within the Japanese prison system. These individuals were in charge of handling prisoners of war, and they were the ones who frequently inflicted the most bloody tortures and punishments on the prison population. The incredible thing is that they didn't limit themselves to beating and starving, but they applied imagination to increase the pain of their victims. In their repertoire were methods such as forcing prisoners to consume liters of water to the brink of suffocation, and then crushing the abdomen by having a person jump on them. This caused vomiting, bleeding, and irreparable damage to the stomach tract. According to the findings of the Tokyo Tribunal, the mortality rate among prisoners of war from the Asian countries invaded by Japan was 27%. Beyond this general data, there was a fundamental fact involving Emperor Hirohito. The leader lifted restrictions mandated by international law on the treatment of detainees of Chinese origin. The decision was ratified on August 5, 1937, and it gave carte blanche to Japanese torturers to eliminate prisoners from China. This is why only 56 prisoners of war from that country were released after Japan's surrender. Annihilation was practically total. Rudolf Joseph Rummel, a professor of political science at the University of Hawaii, maintains that between 1937 and 1945, the Japanese army murdered between 3 and 10 million people. Within that figure were approximately 6 million Chinese, Indonesians, Koreans, Filipinos, and Indo-Chinese. Nationality is not a minor detail, as one of the main driving forces behind Japanese crimes was a racial ideology quite similar to that propagated by Nazism. The Japanese Empire instilled in its population the belief in an innate superiority, asserting that the domination of Asia was not only a possibility, but a right for the supreme nation of the region. From this perspective, other populations were little more than animals deserving the worst treatment. It didn't matter if these conquests meant shooting thousands of people, raping their wives, and murdering their children. Dominating the area was Japan's manifest destiny, and they used all their power to achieve it. After World War II, cases of torture and human experimentation within special Japanese units were revealed. The infamous Unit 731 used pathogens and diseases that were injected into Chinese prisoners in the Manchurian region, with the aim of seeing the results in the human body. Although it is not strictly the use of chemical weapons, which is severely regulated by international law, it is an inhumane procedure that aims to implement viruses and plagues as a tool of destruction. The incredible thing is that these crimes were not included in the Tokyo trial. which is surprising since these are some of the most atrocious activities of the entire conflict. It is like not judging what happened in Auschwitz during the Nuremberg trials. A striking similarity between the trials carried out in Germany and Japan is that in both cases the leaders of the countries could not be prosecuted. On the one hand, Adolf Hitler committed in his bunker, avoiding falling into the hands of Allied justice. On the other hand, Emperor Hirohito was exempt from appearing before the law, but for a radically different reason. The Allies, led by the American General Douglas MacArthur, argued that executing the emperor would make it impossible to recompose relations with the archipelago. Japan was a promising nation, and Washington was well aware that the world of the future included a constant presence in that enclave in the heart of the Pacific. In order to carry out this strategy, some concessions were necessary, such as sparing Hirohito's life, avoiding the maximum humiliation of the empire. But not all Japanese leaders suffered the same fate. Others had to resort to desperate tactics to avoid embarrassment. Many of the accused Japanese officials preferred to commit suicide rather than be arrested and tried in front of the eyes of the world. For example, General Korichika Anami, Minister of War, chose to atone for his great guilt by resorting to seppuku, the Japanese ritual. The practice consists of cutting one's abdomen with a special knife in a specific position and is the only way to regain one's honor before dying. On the other hand, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the creator of the kamikaze pilots, ended his life after failing to honor either his people or his emperor after the defeat against the Allies. His influence during the last part of the war was immeasurable. Due to his orders, images such as those we will see below occurred. In an incredible twist of fate, Onishi ended his own life, in the same way that hundreds of kamikaze pilots died by crashing into enemy ships. These men gave their lives in the service of Japan, for leaders who had no qualms about sacrificing their people in exchange for perpetuating a conflict that had already been lost. Hideki Tojo had been Japan's prime minister in the war, and was considered by both sides to be the architect of the conflicts in the Pacific. The man understood that if he committed suicide, he would take full credit for the failure and defeat against the enemy. In this way, he would avoid dishonoring the imperial family and other important figures in Japan. After the arrival of the American military police at his house, and once his credentials were checked, Tojo retired to his rooms, took a pistol he kept for that purpose, and shot himself in the chest above the heart. After several hours of waiting for an American doctor, and after having his wound sutured, Tojo survived because he did not shoot himself accurately. During his trial, one of the strangest moments of the trial occurred.
One of them is the bald-headed would-be suicide, General Tojo. Another is Dr. Shumei Okawa, sitting just behind him. Watch. Perhaps he found it irresistible. Perhaps he just doesn't like Tojo.
Shumei Okawa, a famous pro-nationalist Japanese intellectual, patted Tojo's bald head, eliciting a smile from the war minister. The reason for this action is not known, but Okawa was later acquitted of charges for not being mentally fit, as he suffered various nervous breakdowns during the trial. Beyond this comedic pause, the process continued until the final resolution. Between 1946 and 1948, Australian Representative Sir William Flood Webb was tasked with leading the 417 sessions that would conclude with 7 death sentences, 6 life imprisonments, 1 20-year sentence, and another of 7 years. Those sentenced to hang were influential generals during the campaign: Kenji Doihara, Koki Hirota, Seishiro Itagaki, Heitaro Kimura, Akira Muto, and the aforementioned Hideki Tojo. Executions were scheduled for November 25th, but were suspended because defense lawyers filed an appeal to the United States Supreme Court. Meanwhile, the entire population of Japan awaited the outcome of this historic trial. After reviewing the appeal, the Supreme Court announced its decision on December 20th with a concise statement: General MacArthur has been chosen and acts as Supreme Commander of the Allied forces. the military tribunal has been established by General MacArthur as the executive organ of the Allied forces. Therefore, the Supreme Court of the United States has no power or authority to review, confirm, reject, or annul the sentence. Hence, the petition is dismissed. The criminals were about to feel the noose tightening around their necks.
The tribunal finds Tojo guilty under count 54.
And sentences to death by hanging the man who suicidally led Japan to stab America in the back.
Thus, after the appeal was rejected, the 7 condemned to the gallows spent their last days of life in Sugamo prison, calm and resigned to their fate. On the eve of the execution, set for midnight on December 22, 1948, the accused requested to speak with a Buddhist priest and wrote letters to their families. At 11:40 p.m. on December 22nd, an American officer accompanied by an armed escort awakened the 7 condemned who, after attending a brief religious service, were led to the gallows accompanied by the Buddhist priest and a prison chaplain. The first group of condemned entered the so-called death chamber, where in the center, brightly lit, awaited a platform on which 5 gallows had been erected. Hideki Tojo, who was the first accused to ascend to the gallows, refused American military rations and requested traditional Japanese dishes, clinging until the last moment to his culture. Tojo approached the scaffold wearing a faded Army auxiliary uniform, without ranks or decorations. Once the 4 accused were hooded, the silence was broken by an unexpected shout of "Banzai!", a war cry of Japanese soldiers. The 4 trapdoors opened simultaneously. After the execution, the bodies were loaded onto military police trucks and taken to the Kubayama crematorium. The ashes were moved to a secret location, and newspapers published a poem that Tojo had dictated before his death. "Farewell to all. Today I will cross the earthly mountains and joyfully enter the fields of Buddha." Very serene words for the person responsible for countless atrocities. In addition to those sentenced to death, all major figures of the Japanese army, lesser sentences were also handed down to thousands of soldiers. These trials were conducted at various points across the Pacific, and some lasted until 1951. However, most of these criminals received minimal punishments that in many cases were not even served. After the executions, and to ease tension between the different representatives of the accused and the prosecutors, a member of the defense stated that peace had to reign among the peoples. The United States had to forget Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Today, Japan is its main military partner in the Pacific and home to the 7th Fleet of the Navy. The debate about the legality and objectives of the Tokyo trials began from the outset. One of the main points of objection was that both the judges and the prosecutors belonged to the same side, undermining the objectivity of the trial's outcome. Furthermore, a much discussed factor was the exclusion of some of the most dangerous and demented perpetrators, such as those operating Unit 731 or Emperor Hirohito himself. In the heart of Bavaria stands Landsberg, a prison where hundreds of people died in the most horrifying ways. Although it may seem unbelievable, many of the most infamous Nazi officers of World War II were executed there by the Allies. The level of sadism inflicted on these criminals was so extreme that political organizations mobilized to the prison gates to demand more humane treatment. In this new installment of Military History, we want to take you inside the most feared Bavarian prison, one whose floors are still stained with blood. Let's begin with this chilling episode.
Eagerly awaited in every part of the world was the climax to the long and strenuous months of the Nuremberg trial. While the judges were considering their verdicts, the military authorities were redoubling their security precautions.
Once World War II ended, It was time to hold accountable and punish those responsible for the most inhuman acts of the conflict. This process included a series of trials, but also the establishment of prisons controlled by the Allies within German territory. Among these facilities was Landsberg, in the southwest of the German state of Bavaria, about 65 kilometers west of the country's capital. The U.S. Army designated the facility as War Criminal Prison No. 1. Between 1945 and the mid-1950s, it was used to house dangerous soldiers and leaders of the Third Reich. For this reason, it was managed and guarded by the military police of the U.S. Army, with sentries well armed and instructed to shoot without hesitation at any suspicious movement. The first prisoners arrived at Landsberg prison in December 1945. From then on, the flow of Nazi soldiers and high-ranking officials was constant. New faces filled with hatred and fear of what would happen to them in a prison controlled by their enemies arrived day after day. Between 1945 and 1946, the facility housed a total of 110 inmates convicted in the Nuremberg trials. Another 1,516 war criminals from the aforementioned Dachau trials and 18 individuals convicted in the Shanghai trials. The latter were military tribunals conducted by U.S. forces in Japan between August 1946 and January 1947, aimed at prosecuting 23 German officials who had continued to assist the Japanese army after the surrender of Nazi Germany.
At the end of the conflict, there were hunts for those war criminals who had committed crimes against people inside the concentration camps, and the Allies also looked for people who had committed crimes against Allied soldiers. With this, many German civilians who had supported the Nazis found themselves accused of murdering Allied servicemen.
The facilities were similar to other prisons of the time, with cells designed for half a dozen prisoners and a notable lack of hygiene and maintenance. Of course, the guards had no regard for the well-being of the men behind bars. They were seen as the worst of the worst and were treated accordingly. From food shortages to constant psychological harassment, the Germans had an uncomfortable stay at the war criminal prison. Let's review one of the most significant dates in the history of that place. On October 16, 1946, the central courtyard of Landsberg prison was prepared for 10 executions and to accommodate several dozen spectators. This date had been set as the final day for several of the prison's most infamous inmates, individuals who, through money or actions, had fostered the most atrocious war crimes in modern history. In that penitentiary gymnasium, one of the loudest met his end shouting, "Heil Hitler!" It was Julius Streicher, editor of the newspaper Der Stürmer, who, through the dissemination of racist stereotypes, even in children's books published by his press, was one of the principal instigators of anti-Semitism in the Third Reich. These images were captured during his trial at Nuremberg.
He was responsible for the demolition on August 10, 1938 of the synagogue in Nuremberg. And on November the 10th, 1938, he spoke publicly in support of the Jewish pogrom which was taking place at that time. In the face of the evidence before the tribunal, it is idle for Streicher to suggest that the solution of the Jewish problem which he favored was strictly limited to the classification of Jews as aliens.
His influence led to the physical extermination of millions of people. But on that day in 1946, Streicher did not have the power to fight gravity. His body was about to be held by a rope tied to his neck, slowly suffocating him until the last spark of life was extinguished. When the mechanism was activated, blood and mucus bubbled from the Nazi's mouth, but he did not die. One of those present had to pull his legs hard and finally broke his neck. The person who assisted in the execution was Joseph Malta, who was then 28 years old. He was a military policeman sent to Landsberg to help with the control of the prisoners. Interviewed in the LA Times in 1996, 3 years before he died, he insisted that he did not regret anything. "It was a pleasure to do it. I would do it again." The difficult death of Stryker was no exception. There was a miscalculation in the length of the ropes, which meant that the prisoners did not die immediately, but rather in a long and tortuous process. Since they did not die from the cervical fracture, the Nazis were suffocating. From the 14 minutes that Joachim von Ribbentrop took, to the 24 that Wilhelm Keitel took. In his book, Justice in Nuremberg, the researcher Robert E. Conant said that the scene was Dantesque. But after having heard all the testimonies and accusations that paraded through the trials, for those present, it evoked an almost biblical justice. The British press reported on the aforementioned problems with the length of the rope and that the condemned men hit their heads on the trapdoor when they fell. However, some experts consider that too much emphasis has been placed on the errors over the years for the sake of sensationalism. To this day, it is not known whether it was done intentionally in a position of revenge or simply a mistake.
A photographer would usually take a final photograph with the condemned stood over where they would seconds later be sent through. The executioner held the noose to the side, and he then took the condemned and placed a black cap over their head, before he finally secured the noose around their necks.
Joachim von Ribbentrop was able to utter a few sentences before the executioner activated the device. After expressing his love for Germany, the Reich's foreign minister said, "My last wish is for Germany to become one nation again, and for an agreement to be reached between the East and the West. I wish for the world to achieve peace." Words too solemn for a man who was an essential participant in Adolf Hitler's war machine. After the deaths of Stryker, Ribbentrop, and Keitel, the Allied military authority allowed the 30 present to smoke a cigarette. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, leader of the SS in Austria, said goodbye with a "Good luck, Germany." Alfred Rosenberg, on the other hand, left in silence. Hans Frank, governor of occupied Poland, smiling, said, "I thank you for the kind treatment I received during my captivity, and I pray to God that He accepts me in His mercy." The chief executioner was John Clarence Woods from Kansas. Most of the executions carried out in Landsberg prison bear his signature at the bottom of the documents. Time magazine recorded his statements after the famous October 16th. When asked if he had been nervous, he confidently replied, "No. A man cannot afford to be nervous in this business." After being examined by the doctor, the lifeless bodies of the Nazi leaders were collected by Rex Morgan, the American Army's chief undertaker in Europe. He placed the bodies in the coffins, where photos were taken and archived. He then transported them to the Dachau crematorium in Munich and, according to his son's publication, told the workers that they were American soldiers who had died in an aircraft accident. For 5.5 years, Landsberg prison was the site of the execution of nearly 300 war criminals condemned for heinous acts such as torture, experimentation, and civilian rape. If we differentiate according to the method used to end the criminals' lives, 259 death sentences were carried out by hanging and 29 by firing squad. A somewhat less painful but also more costly method due to the use of ammunition. These processes were carried out swiftly, demonstrating a compassion and humanity that in many cases the Nazis had not shown towards their prisoners. In 1948, the Association for the Welfare of Prisoners of the Bavarian Ministry of Justice was the organization responsible for managing the basic needs of prisoners detained by the American military. With the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany in May 1949 and its abolition of the death penalty, appeals from politicians, churches, industrialists, and artists resulted in numerous petitions to close War Criminal Prison No. 1. It may sound strange in retrospect, but it was part of a widespread effort to move beyond the traumas of war and bring freedom to all Germans, even those who had committed inhumane acts during the conflict. In the latter half of 1950 and the first half of 1951, thousands of Germans participated in demonstrations outside Landsberg prison to demand pardons for all war criminals. Meanwhile, German media coverage was overwhelmingly on the side of the condemned, who were described as innocent victims of American lynch law. While the treatment received at this institution was not kind, the fact is that the purpose of the place was to carry out death sentences for some of the most savage and violent elements of the Third Reich. At Landsberg, young soldiers who had fought in the trenches or mechanics who had repaired planes in distant parts of Europe were not executed. Instead, it was there that men who had carried out the mass extermination of children, women, the sick, and the disabled were to be executed. Let us hear one of the many statements from the Nuremberg trials.
In connection with the administration of the concentration camps, the SS embarked on a series of experiments on human beings which were performed on prisoners of war or concentration camp inmates. These experiments included freezing to death and killing by poison bullets.
Although the protesters in Landsberg claimed to be motivated solely by opposition to the death penalty and to have no pro-Nazi or anti-Semitic feelings, their actions contradicted their words. When a group of Jewish protesters arrived in Landsberg demanding the execution of the 102 war criminals on January 7, 1951, the German protesters calling for amnesty began chanting the era's slogan, "Out with the Jews, out with the Jews," and then proceeded to beat the Jewish demonstrators. In early 1951, the Bavarian parliament passed a resolution declaring that all military prisoners in Landsberg, Werl, and Wittlich should be recognized as prisoners of war, making them the financial responsibility of the West German government. On January 2, 1951, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer met with the United States High Commissioner for Germany, John J. McCloy, to argue that the status of the Landsberg prisoners was less a legal issue and more a political one, and that executing the Landsberg prisoners would forever ruin any attempt for the Federal Republic to play its role in the Cold War. The German government's position was straightforward. If we annihilate our former military leaders, how could we convince our population that we are now allies? On January 31, 1951, High Commissioner McCloy, under strong pressure from German public opinion, agreed to review the sentences from the Nuremberg and Dachau trials. Of the 28 prisoners sentenced to death, only 7 death sentences were confirmed. Some civilian prisoners who had collaborated with Adolf Hitler's regime were pardoned. The other sentences were commuted to effective prison terms, averaging around 15 years. Let's look at one of the many German reports on the matter.
Kurz nach seiner Ankunft hielt der Hohe Kommissar eine Pressekonferenz ab, in der er die Richtlinien der künftigen amerikanischen Politik in Deutschland darlegte. Wörtlich sagte er, Deutschland muss zu einem friedlichen, freien und wohlhabenden Land gemacht werden.
The 7 death sentences confirmed by Commissioner McCloy were for what were considered the worst of the worst in Landsberg. These were criminals who had a direct impact on the Holocaust and whose actions had resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. The infamous list included Oswald Pohl, Paul Blobel, Otto Ohlendorf, Werner Braune, Erich Naumann, Georg Schallermeyer, and Hans Hermann Schmidt. The German public was not satisfied with McCloy's decision, and as a result, during the first half of the 1950s, the Federal Republic continued to pressure the commissioner to pardon the 7 convicted individuals. Enormous weekly demonstrations were held, demanding amnesty for the Landsberg prisoners. The final executions took place on June 7, 1951, but several prisoners still remained to be dealt with. The government of the Federal Republic of Germany in Bonn decided that war crime convictions by military tribunals should be considered foreign sentences and, therefore, not part of an individual's criminal record. In May 1958, the United States Army relinquished control of Landsberg prison when the last 4 prisoners were released. This marked the end of a story filled with debates, conflicting positions, and political negotiations.
Germany and Landsberg jail, where Hitler wrote some of Mein Kampf, opens to release 29 of his followers, all war criminals, among them Hans KlLLED, former Minister of Church Affairs. Carrying flowers comes Alfred Krupp, head of the famous arms works, and sentenced to 12 years at Nuremberg. Now these former key men of Hitler's state face life as free men in post-war Germany.
To provide a context for what happened in that prison, by 1951, 284 war criminals had been executed there. Their bodies were not claimed by their loved ones. Evidently, SS officers had a better reputation among post-war German politicians than among their own families. The remains were then buried in a cemetery near Spottingen Chapel. In 1988, that site was declared a historic landmark, and today, it is maintained with public funds from local taxpayers. This grants a more than questionable honor to those graves, especially considering that the cemetery does not clearly indicate who is buried there and why they were executed. In light of such controversy, we would like to involve you in this debate that has been ongoing for over 70 years. Do you think the Nazi prisoners at Landsberg were correctly executed, or should they have been treated as prisoners of war? Leave your response in the comments box. Now, let's take a closer look at the stay of the most infamous inmate in the history of this prison. Between November 8 and 9, 1923, Munich was the epicenter of an event that, in the long run, changed the history of the entire planet.
Hitler and his movement had attempted to overthrow the government of the state of Bavaria following years of economic misery and political turmoil following Germany's defeat in World War I in 1918.
That rebellion failed, and Bavarian security forces managed to contain the members of the National Socialist Party, many of whom ended up behind bars in Landsberg prison, including the future Führer. In 1924, Adolf Hitler spent 264 days in prison, during which he wrote Mein Kampf, which can be translated as My Struggle, a manifesto outlining his worldview that he compiled and published with the help of Rudolf Hess. Hess became one of his trusted associates, an absolute fanatic who accompanied him for years during his political expansion. Adolf Hitler was released, smiling and proud, on December 20, 1925. With 3 years, 333 days, 21 hours, and 50 minutes remaining of his brief 5-year sentence. This calculation was made by Ludwig Stenglein, the enraged prosecutor who had sought a severe punishment for the agitator who had committed the crime of high treason. It was the first brick in the construction of a new empire of terror. But what concerns us in this video is the penitentiary institution where he spent 9 months. A place that, over time, came under the control of various authorities, housing all types of prisoners. Today, the prison operates as a progressive correctional center that provides training, skills, and medical assistance to inmates. There are 36 courses in the Central Training Center offering training for occupations such as bakers, electricians, painters, butchers, carpenters, tailors, shoemakers, heating and ventilation workers, and masons. This chapter of Landsberg does not reflect at all the institution's turbulent past and all the bloodshed that occurred inside and outside its walls. Like all remnants of the Third Reich and the post-World War II occupation, its significance remains a subject of study and debate worldwide.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. Most were loyal. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
What you have just seen is an official propaganda of the United States government. There it is announced that Japanese residents in the country will be relocated to concentration camps as a consequence of the attack on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent entry of the United States into World War II. Although they do not know it yet, these people will become the victims of one of the greatest injustices of the 20th century. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you about the daily life of the prisoners in the Japanese internment camp.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
After the hostilities against the Japanese Empire began, a new problem immediately arose. Authorities didn't know what to do with Japanese citizens who had been living in the U.S. for years, let alone had plans for Americans of Japanese descent. The northern country had always prided itself on being a land of opportunities, a nation where anyone who wanted to be an honest worker could make a living and prosper. From its origins, it had been a place that welcomed millions of foreigners from around the world. In that sense, Japanese immigration was no exception. Between 1869 and 1924, an estimated 200,000 Japanese migrated to Hawaii, and another 150,000 ended up on the west coast of the United States. These were men and women who ventured into the unknown in search of opportunities and a better quality of life. Most of them worked in agriculture and small businesses. However, this story had a dark side, as they also had to face racism campaigns. Anti-Japanese organizations proliferated on the West Coast, promoting their segregation. One of the most popular associations of this kind was the infamous Native Sons of the Golden West, which claimed that California land had been created by God for Caucasians, and people of color and non-European foreigners had no right to inhabit it. The government reacted by enacting laws that prohibited Japanese Californians from owning land. Additionally, in 1924, a regulation was passed to make the immigration of undesirable people of Asian origin illegal. The category of undesirable was deliberately ambiguous, with the aim that the authorities could decide who was allowed to populate the United States. As you can see, by 1941, there was already a strong culture of discrimination against the Japanese. However, things would only get worse from then on. After the Pearl Harbor attack, U.S. authorities entered a state of widespread paranoia. For the Japanese living in the United States, whether born in the Japanese Empire or simple descendants, nothing was the same anymore. They were viewed with suspicion on the streets, as if they had been direct collaborators in the massacre in Hawaii. Simply because of belonging to another ethnicity, it was assumed that they agreed with the bombing, and the rest of the population sought to isolate them. The U.S. government was convinced that the Japanese Empire was preparing a large-scale military invasion of its territory. Although this assumption was far from reality, It fostered the false belief that Japan had spies scattered throughout the country. Under this strange logic, any man or woman of Japanese descent could be, in reality, an undercover agent working to destroy the United States from within. In 1942, 2 months after the Pearl Harbor attack, President Franklin Roosevelt authorized the evacuation and relocation of Japanese Americans. They were to be detained and forcibly moved to military zones, that is, areas guarded by the Army whose exact location was not known. The Japanese community learned about it through bulletins posted on the streets and in the shop windows. In the following days, entire families had to leave their homes behind and travel into the unknown, with no certainty of what would happen. They were only allowed to take clothes and personal belongings with them. They were not even allowed to travel with their pets, so they had no choice but to leave them behind. Here you can see Marion Takahara, a survivor of the camps, recalling that difficult moment.
We had to put our dog to sleep because we didn't know what to do with it. People that came in and wanted to buy everything we had and stuff, things like that. But that night before we left, we all slept on the floor. And I hate talking about it because it just makes me cry.
The transfer was carried out to the interior of the country, as far away from the Pacific coast as possible. Authorities believed that if they were isolated inland, cut off, and permanently monitored by troops, they nullified any possibility of espionage. Initially, Japanese Americans were supposed to go to temporary accommodation, where they lived for a few weeks before being moved again. The government reacted by enacting laws that prohibited Japanese Californians from owning land. Additionally, in 1924, a regulation was passed to make the immigration of undesirable people of Asian origin illegal. The category of undesirable was deliberately ambiguous, with the aim that the authorities could decide who was allowed to populate the United States. As you can see, by 1941, there was already a strong culture of discrimination against the Japanese. However, things would only get worse from then on. After the Pearl Harbor attack, U.S. authorities entered a state of widespread paranoia. For the Japanese living in the United States, whether born in the Japanese Empire or simple descendants, nothing was the same anymore. They were viewed with suspicion on the streets, as if they had been direct collaborators in the massacre in Hawaii. Simply because of belonging to another ethnicity, it was assumed that they agreed with the bombing, and the rest of the population sought to isolate them. In 1942, 2 months after the Pearl Harbor attack, President Franklin Roosevelt authorized the
You walked in the room and there was just one bare light bulb, and they had these canvas cots that you had to assemble in order to sleep on, and they gave you there was a little thin mattress, cot mattress, and a couple of army blankets per person, and that was it. All we could take with us were what we could carry. I mean, there was 2 suitcases.
Evacuation and relocation of Japanese Americans. They were to be detained and forcibly moved to military zones, that is, areas guarded by the Army whose exact location was not known. The Japanese community learned about it through bulletins posted on the streets and in the shop windows. In the following days, entire families had to leave their homes behind and travel into the unknown, with no certainty of what would happen. They were only allowed to take clothes and personal belongings with them. They were not even allowed to travel with their pets, so they had no choice but to leave them behind. Here you can see Marion Takahara, a survivor of the camps, recalling that difficult moment. The transfer was carried out to the interior of the country, as far away from the Pacific coast as possible. Authorities believed that if they were isolated inland, cut off, and permanently monitored by troops, they nullified any possibility of espionage. Initially, Japanese Americans were supposed to go to temporary accommodation, where they lived for a few weeks before being moved. These sites were not prepared to accommodate so many families. They were dirty and disorganized. In fact, some remember them as little more than sheds that had once served for fairs or horse races. Inside, the barracks were divided by thin walls that did not reach the ceiling. Each family could hear what the next one was doing, so there was no privacy. They couldn't even sleep comfortably since, at night, many would wake you up to the sounds made by young children. However, this did not compare to what they would experience in the internment camps. After a few weeks in temporary shelters, Japanese descendants were loaded onto trains bound for the most inhospitable areas of the United States. Thus,
in the meantime, we are setting a standard for the rest of the world in the treatment of people who may have loyalties to an enemy nation. We are protecting ourselves without violating the principles of Christian decency.
the serene views of the West Coast gave way to desolate mountains, endless deserts, and bewildering swamps. In the camps, families were allowed to live together, although they had to stay in overcrowded and poorly equipped barracks. After all, they had been built in record time during the summer of 1942, and they were not made with the comfort of their inhabitants in mind. Here, you can hear Bob Fuchigami, a survivor of the camps, describe what it was like to live there. The bathrooms and showers were external to the barracks and had to be shared with all the other prisoners. On the other hand, there was practically no ventilation, so summers became unbearable. This, combined with poor hygiene conditions, led to the spread of diseases like wildfire. Not surprisingly, there were epidemics of dysentery, smallpox, and typhoid fever. The medical teams in charge of the internment centers were not able to cope with the wave of diseases. They lacked the supplies and, even more, the necessary personnel for it. So they had to reinforce vaccination campaigns among the Japanese. In the camps, the inmates had nothing to do but wait. They had to wait for the war to end to be set free. In these conditions, a prisoner's main enemy was boredom. The absence of routine could shatter their psyche, so to counteract this effect, many decided to find employment. Although they were not obligated to do so, it allowed them to earn money and save for the future. It was a bet that they would survive the confinement and rebuild their lives.
We were patriotic, loyal citizens before camp. We were loyal, patriotic citizens while we were in camp, and we were loyal, patriotic citizens after camp. This was our only nation.
The camps were a kind of ghettos monitored by troops. This meant that, like in any neighborhood inhabited by large families, hundreds of jobs needed to be covered. They needed cashiers, teachers, office workers, laborers, cleaning staff, sellers, firefighters, cooks, nurses, and so much more. They worked full-time, more than 40 hours a week from Monday to Friday. But despite all their effort, they did not receive a decent salary. On the contrary, employers paid them little, taking advantage of the fact that they were ultimately prisoners with no real job alternatives. However, despite all this, the official propaganda continued to speak of the internment camps as quasi-paradisical places. Many Japanese tried to produce their own food by cultivating the land of the internment camps. This became so common that eventually, almost all Japanese detention centers had pig and chicken farms. Vegetable production was so high that they hardly needed to be supplied by the US government. In fact, what happened was the opposite. In 1942, the sugar beet fields in the western part of the country were neglected because the workers had gone to war. Since there was no one to work the land, the authorities brought in the Japanese to do the agricultural work, and once finished, they locked them up again.